Welcome, conservationists. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. Today, we're going to talk about your favorite and mine, Canada thistle, and how to control it in natural areas. My name is Jason Anderson. I am a wildlife biologist for Pheasants Forever. I work in a partnership with the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service to provide technical assistance to landowners with wildlife technical assistance. Basically, we help people build habitat in agricultural areas. And my job would not be possible if it was not through partnerships, including the Iowa DNR, the USDA, Lost Hills Alliance, and local Pheasants Forever chapters and soil and water conservation districts. Partnerships make conservation happen. That is my tagline, my plug. With Canada thistle, it is an old problem. In doing my research for this talk, I actually learned that it was the first noxious weed labeled in the United States. It was categorized as a noxious weed, the first one in the United States before it was even the United States. It was in 1795 in Vermont. So they recognized, well, it was, I guess stepping back a little bit, Canada thistle is a perennial weed from Europe and Eastern Asia, Northern Africa, and it was accidentally imported into the United States in the 1600s, basically along with the Europeans that came to North America, and it has been a problem since then. So this has been a fight for 200 years, so don't feel bad that you're having problems with it. Kind of puts it in perspective. Right after that amount of time, there has been no good solution to fighting this problem. It just takes work, sweat equity, if you will. Control of Canada thistle relies on persistent targeted management. This picture, incidentally, this is from Audubon County. I'll call out Audubon County because I don't work there anymore. But you can see this is all this white fluffy. This is all Canada thistle that has gone to seed. And then it's actually going down the valley, down all through this draw. But you can kind of get an idea of the scope of what can happen with this plant. It can create quite the infestation, and lots of people have questions about it. And the conventional ways of managing it aren't necessarily the most effective, I guess. Let's put it that way. What we are going to talk about today, we're going to talk about, first of all, how to identify the plant so that we know that we're controlling the right thing, because there's a lot of stuff that actually kind of people do get confused with Canada thistle. We're going to talk about the biology of the plant, the life cycle of Canada thistle, because we are going to be using the biology against itself. Then we'll talk about the actual management of it, and then weighing your options and trying to figure out, instead of telling people specific things that they need to do, I try to educate folks so that they can make their own decisions for their own farm. We'll step into the identification here first. The easiest way to identify Canada thistle is to compare it to other thistles that you see. It's kind of weird. It's challenging in the way that it's so indistinct, other than the differences between other species. So first bullet point, up to 4 feet tall, and it's usually in patches. So the up to 4 feet tall, it is shorter than other thistles. Typically, your average bull and musk thistle are the other two big invasive thistles that we have in our area of the country, Southwest Iowa, and they can grow 8 feet tall potentially. There's a lot of them out flowering right now, and if you were to go and measure them, they would be 5, 6, maybe up to 8 feet tall. The bull thistle is blooming right now, and musk thistle will bloom a little bit later, but they're both tall thistles. Canada thistle, by comparison, is quite short. Usually it's 2 to 3 feet tall, up to 4. And generally it grows in dense patches, colonies. So if you walk out there and there is just a solid patch of thistles, chances are it is going to be Canada thistle. I guess I should also say, all thistles have spines on them as well. So that is the main indicator. If you're not much of a botanist, which I suspect that at least most of you kind of know what Canada thistle looks like, or thistles in general, but they're spiny. The vegetation and or leaves often have spines on them, and they're generally very deeply lobed as well. The leaves, like you can see down here, have lobes on them. We'll have some better pictures of that later. That was an afterthought, talking about the thorns and the leaves, because I just kind of take some things for granted, I guess. The next thing, when I was talking about earlier that Canada thistle or thistles in general, you might get them confused with other things. With thistles especially, the leaves, both sides of the leaf will often be the same color or very similar shade of green, the same shade of green. So if you were to take a leaf of Canada thistle or bull or musk thistle and flip it over and look at the reverse side, it's basically the same color green. We have a bunch of native thistles in Iowa as well, which are not aggressive. They are not mandatory to control according to the Iowa noxious weed law. If you flip over that leaf, it is almost paper white. So it'll be a dark green on the top of native thistles. And then if you flip it over, it's almost like a piece of paper. And that is because it's got a lot of these silver hairs on it, and that's a heat adaptation. And the other introduced noxious thistles do not have that. So that's a way that you can also tell your introduced invasive thistles from native thistles, is that both sides of the leaf on the invasive thistles are basically the same color green. Third point there, many bottle-shaped flowers less than 1 inch across. And you can see on the picture on the right, you see the flower head, there's this main stalk that comes up and then it divides, and each stem has like a bunch of flowers at the end of it. Okay, and that is indicative of Canada thistle, if nothing else. Bull and musk thistle often will have just a single flower at the end of each individual stalk and not a cluster of them. And also that second piece of that, less than 1 inch across, in the bottom left here, I have this image comparing the size of flowers of bull and Canada thistle. And again, Canada thistle is a smaller one. So this is, usually they're more 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch, but usually less than 1/4 in size. Bull thistle by comparison is huge, like it's 5 times the size. So it's there's a big difference in the plant and the plant size and the flower size compared to other, and that's important because the control is different for bull and musk thistle. Bull and musk thistle in perennial plantings, like what we are dealing with in natural areas where there's perennial grass, it is much easier to control bull and musk thistle than it is Canada thistle. And then the last point, it blooms in June through July. With native thistles, one of the easiest ways to tell if it's blooming to tell the difference is the reverse side of the leaf is white. But if it's blooming now, it's an introduced thistle. I mean, it's just that simple. All the native thistles, they bloom way later in the summer. So if you have bud formation and that kind of thing, and you're wondering, oh, is this a introduced thistle or is it a native thistle? The native thistles bloom much later in the year, usually August, September. It's important to know what you're dealing with so that you're not targeting something that you don't have to, or you might waste your time on, because Canada thistle management is fairly labor intensive. And if you can do easier things to control if you can do easier things to control bull or musk thistle, then I would recommend doing that. And then native thistles, you don't necessarily even have to control. So I tell people not to worry about those. So small purple flowers, short statured plant, thorns, blooming around now, Canada thistle, pretty safe bet. We talked about how to identify it. Now we're going to talk about the individual biology of that plant. And again, we're going to use the biology against it. So that's why we're going to biology school here. We're going to talk about it. So we're in the top left, we're going to start at the very beginning of the spring. So this would be in, say, March. You're going to get the little spring rosette that comes up. And that's really just a little circle of leaves that come up, and it'll be kind of fuzzy with thorns around the margins of the leaves. Canada thistle, like I said, is a perennial plant. And if you don't know what that term means, it means that it dies back and comes back from the rootstock every year. It does not put off seed and then die. It comes back from its roots. So it's a perennial plant, and it can spread by seed and by horizontal root growth, which is what makes it such a huge pain in conservation plantings or natural areas in general, because it's a perennial plant that can spread by rhizomes. That's the horizontal root. And so that makes it compete very well with the surrounding vegetation. And that's also what causes it to form in clumps. In that previous slide, we talked about you can identify Canada thistle by its colony formation. Well, that's what causes it, because you get all these roots that come out, and year after year, the root base continues to grow, and you get more and more plants, and they just continue to clone and just outcompete everything in a really dense patch, essentially. So in the spring, you get the little basal rosettes will pop up, and as the growing season goes along through May, you have a process elongation, which is just a fancy word of saying it grows. So the leaves get longer, they elongate. Biologists love terms. And then it's also going to send up a central stalk, a shoot, or a bolt, or a bolt is also called. So it sends up that main stem that is going to turn into the flower. And around in May, late May, it's going to start forming buds. And you can see that picture there. They're just little kind of nodules that have reddish hairs on them, pinkish reddish hairs on them. And that is going to be a very important phase for you to remember, because if we were going to use the biology of the plant against it, we want to target that budding period, the in between the budding into the flowering, because those buds is what, when it forms the buds, that is what opens up into the flowers. That's what gets pollinated and turns into seeds. So as we turn the corner down there, the flowering occurs in Iowa. It occurs around June through July, mid-June through July, and then it goes to seed fairly quickly. Generally, it's around 2 weeks turnaround, I think, something like that. It kind of varies. The information varies, but from what I've seen around here locally, it's around 2 weeks. Very fast, it seems like. The flowers will turn into seeds, and you can see the little the fluffy bits, like it's like little balls of cotton that the flower heads turn into, and that is what catches the wind and then blows off into your neighbor's property and spreads the joy of Canada thistle around the neighborhood. And that all basically from the spring rosette to the seeding, setting seed, that goes through March, basically through July. So it's fairly short. Everything past that is right in this little last part here that we're going to talk about, because this occurs at the hard freeze when winter starts out. So basically, after the plant is set seed in the summer, it just kind of hangs out and doesn't do much. It pretty much essentially just looks like this with a dead stalk sticking out the top of it. It's just going to sit there, and it's going to do a little bit of vegetative growth. And then when the winter comes and the first hard freeze, I believe it's 28 degrees. When that happens, then that's going to trigger the plant to go dormant. And that's going to be the second thing that's the second time period that's going to be super important for management, is when that thing goes dormant. Because in the wintertime, it's going to go dormant, and then it's going to sit through the winter until it warms up again. March, it's going to boom, come up in the little rosettes, and the whole cycle is going to start over again. That's the basics of the biology against it, or sorry, the biology of the plant that we're going to try to use against it. Speaking of which, we are going to get into the management. So this handout, I want to bring you to that. This is from Perdue University in Indiana, and it summarizes quite nicely all the things that I'm going to say. The only bad thing about this is that it is written for Indiana and not Iowa, in a latitude kind of way. Iowa and Indiana is like slightly south, but most of the timing and all the information is solid that is in this document. The only exception that I should say is that if you are managing land that is in the Conservation Reserve Program through the USDA, the rules that it mentions in here for CRP are specific to Indiana, and they are not the same as what they are in Iowa. That would be the only change, and it's not super different. The rest of the information is all good, and I like it because it describes basically all the things that I talk about when I speak with people about Canada thistle. So if you want a nice written document for what I'm talking about, this is the one. So you can either follow along in there or refer to it later as well. To the actual management, we're going to go back to our biology class. And we're going to remember those stages that we had with budding, flowering, seeding, dormancy being the most important ones. And this is the framework that we're going to talk about management in. It's very busy, so I deleted all that stuff. So I hope you remembered your different phases so that I don't have to have the words up there. For Canada thistle management, the most common and effective way is what I call the two-pronged approach. I don't know if I coined that or if I stole it from someone. I have no idea, but that's what I refer to it as. The two-pronged approach, because we're attacking it from two different directions. We're doing a spring disturbance followed by a fall spraying. And it's super important, again, because Canada thistle is a perennial plant that is aggressive and hard to kill. You kind of have to do two different, every year, you have to do two different applications of management on it to be able to really gain any kind of ground with it. If it was a less aggressive plant or an annual, it'd be way easier to manage, but unfortunately, it's not the case. Again, remember, over 200 years, we've been trying to get a leg up on this stupid thing and have not been able to. So it just takes sweat equity and work. So the two-pronged approach. The first thing we're going to talk about is spraying or mowing during the budding stage. When the plant is growing, it pops up in the springtime, and the whole name of the game is to set seed. That is how it survives. The survival method for plants, right, is to gather energy and then put out as much seed as it can or do as much reproduction. Biology is all about sex, as I say in my classes. So it's going to try to reproduce as much as possible to try to propagate. With that in mind, it is putting a lot of, like, basically all of its energy is put into those flowers. Because that's the end game. In the springtime, puts out the rosette, it grows through the elongation, right? And those are essentially solar panels that are fueling the production of those flower buds. So it's pulling a lot of energy out of its root system, out of all the above ground vegetation, and it's putting that energy into the flower buds. And so that is the thing that we're going to use against it, because it's committing all this energy. The plant, individual plant, is committing all this energy to those flower buds. And that is the time we're going to go in there and either spray it or mow it. Okay. And so that is the spring disturbance. You're going to go out right at that budding. Ideally, it's at the budding phase before the flower has opened. But after the flower is opened is also after the flower is opened, but before it has set seed is also acceptable, just not as effective. Ideally, you want to get in there right as that bud is finishing forming, when it's just about to open, and then you go out and mow it or spray it. You can get some complete mortality of the plant doing spraying. Mowing is not going to kill the plant. It's just going to set it back. In most cases, when you spray and mow both, you are only top killing the plant. So you're not actually killing the plant itself, but you are setting it back by robbing it of all that energy that it used to put into that flower bud. Okay. And you're also preventing it from setting seed because you have cut the flowers off. And it's a little bit variable whether Canada thistle will go to seed if it goes to some plants. Let me step back. Some plants, if they flower, they will go to seed no matter what you do to that plant. You could chop it up, short of chopping it up in a blender, it will set seed. It's a little variable if Canada thistle can do that or not. It depends on how far along the plant, how far along the flowering is, whether it got pollinated or not or whatever. But the worst that happens is you try. So if you go out and spray it and top kill it, you're only helping. There's no reason to not go and treat your Canada thistle when it's flowering. If nothing else, it'll keep the neighbors happy. But either way, you're going to mow or spray at that budding stage or slightly thereafter. And then that is going to top kill the plant and cause the rest of the plant body to be weakened. And I just I'm sorry, I was lazy and I reused this picture for both of them. But this one will just pretend like it is just the rosette on the ground that has been mowed off. Again, we're spraying, mowing, top killing the plant and robbing it of that energy. So it's going to go through the hot summer having been robbed of that energy and being weakened. And that is when that's the condition it's going to go into the fall. when it's about to go dormant. And that is when we hit it again. So that's where the two-pronged approach comes in, okay? So spring disturbance, go out, spray or mow, and then you create a weakened plant that you can then follow up with an application of herbicide right around the time that it is gonna go dormant. So right around that hard freeze. In Iowa, typically that is, if it hasn't happened earlier, generally it's the first 2 weeks of October. So if you go out and follow up spray your thistles the latter half of September, early October, that's like perfect. If it's a little bit earlier, also probably fine. It's just, I mean, it's hard to time these things because you don't know what Mother Nature is going to do. So when it's got this weakened plant over the summer, the plant is weak, you go out there and you spray it right before that hard frost. What happens then is that you have applied herbicide to this plant, and then the hard freeze happens. Like I said, it gets down to 28 degrees or lower. So that is what triggers the plant to go into dormancy. And so it takes all the remaining energy that it has in its above ground vegetation, pulls it down to its root reserves so that it can overwinter. And so it's already weakened. And then you are also adding herbicide to it. And so that's how when it goes dormant, takes all the energy down into its root system with it, it is also translocating that herbicide. And that is where you get the majority of your mortality, is through that fall spraying. That's why it's super important. Like I said, the conventional kind of way to control Canada thistle might be just to mow it in the spring or maybe spray it in the spring. And a lot of times I don't see people doing that fall application. And that's really where the moneymaker is. And that's what I encourage people to make sure that they're doing, is do the fall application. For the most part, well, mowing just makes you feel better. It doesn't actually do anything to kill the plant. All it's doing is making it produce less seed, but it will still reproduce by vegetative growth. So if you mow, like you see this on the sides of interstates a lot, the DOT, not calling anybody out, but the DOT will, they will just mow those patches. And so they just become more and more dense. And that's because it's just sitting there vegetatively reproducing through those horizontal roots, and it's not putting off any seed, but it's still cloning and creating more dense patches. And if you were to get a year where the mowing got skipped, it would put out a bunch of seed for sure. And likewise, because spring spraying for most products is not going to actually kill the root system, it's just going to top kill it. So it'll turn brown, it'll look like you killed it, but it's just going to keep coming back for most products. There are chemical products out there that have a little bit better efficiency with spring spraying than others. For the most part, spring spraying alone does not work. You got to have that fall spraying and take advantage of that hard freeze and the dormancy to get the majority of your mortality. And then retreat is needed. So you need to it'll take at least a couple years to manage a patch of Canada thistle. And maybe you'll be out there forever. Again, 200 years trying to figure this out. And we still have Canada thistle everywhere. It's, I didn't say this before, but Canada thistle is basically prevalent in all of the continental United States, except for like a few corners in the Southeast for whatever reason. I don't know if that's a moisture thing or heat thing or what, but for the most part in the United States, Canada thistle is a huge problem for everyone. So no one's alone. We all have to work at it, unfortunately. One last thing that I was going to mention about management of Canada thistle. So we say control of Canada thistle or management of Canada thistle. So when I talk with people, I tell them that, eradication is a perfectly fine goal to have, but be ready to be disappointed. Some people have the expectation that they're going to kill all of their thistles, or at some point in time be able to manage Canada thistle completely off of their farms. I think that's fine to try to do that, but you're going to go crazy, and it's not really a realistic goal to have. What we're trying to do is just control and manage the problem. It's always going to be there, most likely. We're just trying to keep it from being a bigger problem, trying to avoid those big patches, and trying to keep it from setting seed and spreading. If there's a few plants on the farm here and there, yeah, technically maybe you should by law go out and tackle those, but I'm not going to tell you you need to. And in fact, I'm pretty sure the revised, I should have looked at this. I wanted to have it ready, but I couldn't find it in the cesspool that is the Iowa state code. But I tried to find the revised version of the Iowa noxious weed law, because they've recently kind of changed that and recategorized the different noxious weeds. There's only one weed that is actually required for eradication, and that is Palmer amaranth, which is an annual, really aggressive annual weed from down south. The other ones are only scheduled for management or control, which it's important to note that that is not the same as complete eradication. Eradication is every single individual plant is gone. Management is we are just trying to control the problem in some, not in 100% kind of control sort of way. Whew. Going back to this document, it's PDF. It's short and sweet, talks about Canada thistle identification, basically kind of the similar things that I talked about, different life stages, and then a list of control options. And it talks about more control options than I did. It includes talking about disking, which is a terrible idea. That is what the document says. Do not disc a field for Canada thistle control, because you're going to have a bad time. Also, it talks about burning. But then at the bottom down here, it has this list of chemicals, herbicides. Let's turn this over so we can actually read it. So this is actually the reason that I really like this document. I like the information that's up in the top, but it also has these very well verbalized recommendations for different herbicide options. You can read it for yourself. It doesn't really matter. I personally do not care what herbicide you use when you do your spring or fall spraying. You might use the same herbicide, you might use a different one. Whatever you use, my advice is to follow the labeled rates, follow the instructions that come with the jug of herbicide that you choose. That's obviously the most important thing. Follow the labeled rates and then retreat. That's the important thing. A lot of people will use an aminopyralid. That's this, well, like they commonly call it milestone. That's like the most common one, but there's a bunch of different flavors of aminopyralid. That one, especially in native areas or CRP or native stands in general, there are a lot of native plants, native wildflowers that are resistant to aminopyralid. So that is kind of nice, that if you do get some overspray, you're not going to necessarily kill off everything, because many of these chemicals, like clopyralid, 2,4-D, dicamba, they're going to kill everything. Every broadleaf that they come in contact with, they're going to kill. And then even like glyphosate, Roundup, or whatever your off-the-shelf version of glyphosate is, that is a broad spectrum, so it's gonna kill everything, including grasses. When you're selecting your herbicide, you need to make sure how the product works and how targeted you can be, which actually brings us into the next slide. But the last thing then is to weigh your options. So my advice is to be as targeted as you can. That is the comeback from that handout, is to, when you are weighing all your options, there's all kinds of things that are going to come into it. How much time you got, what kind of product, what kind of a problem you have, how big your patch is, what your stand composition is, because if it's all grass and barely any wildflowers or legumes or whatever, it's going to be much easier to spot treat all the thistles. And then how much overspray, like that's the main thing. Like this is where I cannot give specific advice. I can't give general advice that's going to fit for everybody. So I try to give advice that people can use and teach them to make those decisions for themselves. So if you have, for example, a pasture that is all forage grass, like smooth brome and orchard grass or whatever, and you have a Canada thistle issue out there, well, you can use something that's a little bit more aggressive, like 2,4-D and clopyralid, because there's no collateral damage to be had, right? But if you have a conservation reserve program CRP seeding that's got native grass and a bunch of wildflowers, and you love seeing those flowers out there, well, you might need to be a little bit more targeted with whatever product you use. Use something like an aminopyralid product that you're going to be able to have a little bit of resistance in the native plants. But not all of them are going to be resistant. So some of them are certainly going to be killed by overspray if you get jiggy with it. I mean, the other big thing is how big is your patch and how dense is it? Because some areas you might be able to go and treat individual plants, but other ones, there's just so many thistles in there that you pretty much have to broadcast spray. Or if you treat individual plants, you are effectively broadcast spraying the entirety of the patch. So those are different things that you have to consider. So that's why my standard advice is to be as targeted as you can stomach. So some people, they are more than happy to take a backpack sprayer or a little pump sprayer and go out there and treat individual Canada thistle plants. Other people, they're just like, no, there's no way I have time for that. And they have to do some broadcast spraying, and you have to, in that case, accept some collateral damage of your wildflowers or your adjacent broadleaves. Two things that are bad about that: when you overspray and kill adjacent plants, adjacent desirable plants, we'll say, whether it's legumes in a hayfield or native wildflowers in a CRP stand or whatever, there are other plants that you want to keep that you are going to overspray and kill them by treating your Canada thistle. Two things about that. One is that you spent money to put those plants in the ground. So those have a dollar figure associated with them. It might be hard to quantify, but those plants are worth something. And then two, the thing that they are worth is that they directly compete with the Canada thistle. So when you have a patch of thistles and you have plants that are competing with those thistles, and you remove them along with your thistles, the thistles are more aggressive than the other plants. And so sometimes what you get is more thistles. So you want to be, whereas if you were to be a little bit more targeted and not overspray as much, then you're treating the individual thistle and then allowing that adjacent plant to do a little bit better, and then it can help outcompete your thistle problem. Typically, when I see people folks that do targeted management of Canada thistle, the ones that are more targeted are more successful control, because those desirable plants are helping outcompete. They're helping you do the management for you. Okay. So whether you might spend more time by being more targeted, but by doing that, you're allowing the natural area itself, the desirable plants, to help you along with that management. So, but to be fair, it is more work, but the advice, again, be as targeted as you can stomach. So to summarize, know your target species, because you want to minimize the collateral damage and the amount of work that you have to do. And then use the biology against the plant, because that is what is going to make your management application the most effective, is by using the biology against it. In most cases, like any kind of invasive species management, we're trying to use the biology of the plant against it. So the better you know the biology, the better you're going to be able the more effective control you're going to get. Third point, the management point. So the recommended way to do it is to control it with a spring disturbance, followed by a fall spraying, and then retreat as needed. And that that spring disturbance, that can be either mowing or spraying, and then followed by the fall spraying before it goes through that dormancy period, so that you can get that good mortality. And then again, be as targeted as you can stomach. That's can't stress that enough, because it's good for so many reasons. In the long term, it is much better. So that's why I say be as targeted as you can stomach, because some people, everybody's going to have different tolerances for how targeted they can be. If you have questions, more than happy to chat about stuff. I found that a lot of people have questions about it, so don't be shy to speak up.
I have two questions, I think. if you're following the phases of the thistle, and when they start the buds, that should be like in May, correct? That's what you said.
Probably right in May. Yep.
Yeah. So the nesting season starts on May 15th. What do you?
Oh yeah.
What do you do?
See, I knew I was going to leave stuff out. Okay, so for those people that have land enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Program, there is, so it talks about this in that guide, and that's one of the things that's different. So in Iowa, the primary nesting season for birds, it runs from May 15th through August 1st. And if you're in CRP, the Farm Service Agency, the organization that administers CRP, the program, they do not let you do management during that time. So May 15th through August 1st, you can't do stuff, but they do want you to control thistles and do management that impacts the stand. And all you really have to do is contact the FSA office and tell them, hey, I got some patches of Canada thistle and we're going to mow them or spray them or do whatever. Basically, you just have to notify them. You have to, give prior notice that you're going to be doing management out there. And honestly, the reason for that is if somebody's your neighbor's driving by your place and they're like, oh, Charlotte's out there mowing her CRP, and they complain, well, then the FSA knows that that you're doing that and it's fine. So, I mean, they want you to do the thistles, you just got to let them know. So just give them a heads up. That's really what it amounts to.
Okay. And then, so if you decided to mow it then in the spring and you've got your pollinators there, is that going to hurt the pollinators?
It can. Yep, absolutely. So, it kind of goes back to, I mostly focused on, when I was talking about collateral damage, I was talking about spraying, but it applies to mowing as well. But just like mowing is not going to kill the Canada thistle, it's also not going to kill the native wildflowers, the desirable stuff. And something that I didn't mention while I was talking about the mowing is that one of the reasons you want to time your mowing or spraying as late as possible, like that bud stage where the buds are just about to open up, is because you don't want to do it too early. If you mow too early, like if you were to mow beginning of June, early May, you might see that there's thistles out there and that they're starting to do vertical growth. They're starting to bolt, and you go out there and mow them. Well, they're just gonna create more flower buds. Like, it's not going to actually do the work that you think it's going to do because they haven't yet. The plant body, it's still vegetatively growing and it has not committed to those buds. Does that make sense? So if they're just doing vegetative growth and you top kill it or you just mow it off, then it's going to just send out another shoot at the bottom and try to create a bud again, just with a shorter stalk. And so that's why you want to wait as late as you can to mow your thistle, because then you don't get that rebudding effect. And most wildflowers are the exact same way. But when you mow Canada thistle, when you mow your thistles, the wildflowers, many of them don't start budding until summer, like midsummer or later. And so if you mow them, they'll usually just be shorter, but they'll still flower and put off seed. So it's not as detrimental to mow at that time for the wildflowers as it is the Canada thistle. That's a long-winded answer for your question, but I think I hit all the points that I wanted to.
What about burning?
Well, you can use burning to help control thistle. You can, so any kind of disturbance is going to invigorate thistles. Typically, you're going to get, so that's why disking is so bad. So if you go and you disc a field, it's going to just explode into thistles because they're going to take advantage of all that open soil. Mm-hmm. Similarly, burning is also going to do something very similar because you're disturbing the existing stand and you're creating a void that the thistle is just going to flush and all go. But again, you can use it to your advantage. With burning, you can't, after a burn, you're typically going to get a flare up of thistles. If you have a thistle problem on the farm, you're going to get a flare up. But you can use it to your advantage because, one, there's no thatch on the ground anymore, and it's going to invigorate all the thistles. so that you can go and you can do treatment much more easily. You might have to do more of it, but you can get you can get access to the thistles way easier. So some, in a few different farms that I've had that had really bad infestations, we used prescribed fire as kind of a rescue technique. They went and they burned essentially the whole farm or half the farm. And then the next year, it just looks like a forest of thistles out there. And they just went out there and just sprayed like crazy. And they dumped all the work of that spring treatment into that first spring. And then they went and followed up and did it. And they were able to use a little bit more of an aggressive herbicide because they were being more targeted. So they were literally going up with a UTV, making passes back and forth. And then they were spraying each individual plant. And they just did that for a few days going across the farm. And then they did a follow-up spraying in the fall. Now those farms look great. It was amazing. Like the huge difference that it made. And I think that part of that was because those plants were invigorated by the fire. And so it caused that big seed bank to all flush and germinate, exposing it for the treatment is what it amounted to. So
Okay.
yeah, I went by one of those here a few weeks ago and I was like, oh my God, it looks super clean. Like I went out there, the first problem, and it was probably 90% canopy cover of Canada thistle. And now, I don't know, less than 10% probably. So huge difference. So yeah, fire can be used, but the main thing is the targeted management, I think, in that case. David, how are you faring on your thistles? Or do you have any?
Well, I just wanted to listen, on the discussion and see what all the questions were. That's, I've been spraying Canadian thistles for 50 years. It's ongoing. You have to stay with it. It's not for a beginner. And you brought up really good answers to it. It's a two-time approach, sometimes 4. Knock them down in the spring, and the most important part is spray them in the fall before they freeze, so they can take that product down to the roots. Roots, they tell me, I haven't dug. They tell me 12 feet. I don't know. That's why most people think they're killing Canadian thistle with 2,4-D because it burns it down to the top of the ground. Well, they'll go back to the coffee shop and say, well, I killed it with 2,4-D. Well, it's not really true. And 28 days, all of a sudden there's a rosette appears because from the roots that you talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody thinks they killed it, but the definition of killing is long lasting.
Yeah. It just makes you feel better typically.
Like I said, you go back to the coffee shop, everybody said that they killed their Canadian thistle. They burned it down to the ground and it looks dead. By definition, in 4 weeks, that's not really dead because I call them tillers. I can't remember what you call it. They spread by the roots, horizontal roots.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I'm glad you hit on that, Jason.
Rhizomes
yes,
is what I said. Yeah.
Rhizomes, that's correct. Rhizomes. Farmers call it tillering. Rhizomes, That's correct. So my method, my weapon of choice is Grazon. Did you mention that?
Not specifically by trade name, but if I remember my chemicals correctly, I think that's aminopyrrolate and 2,4-D mixed together, or maybe aminopyrrolate and something else. I think it's 2,4-D though, but yeah, what Grazon Next HL, I think is the trade name that a lot of people use for that. As far as I know, at least I've heard anyway.
That's what I use. I got 1,600 acres I manage, and keep everything down. And great, like I said, Grazon is my choice. I spray it in the spring and May, right now as we speak, and then come back on those same patches in October. And that seems to be it's pretty close to 100% if you can get that product that thistle to take that down into the roots.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I agree 100% with you.
Thanks for backing me up. I appreciate that. You'll receive your paycheck in the mail. Well, thanks everybody for coming. Good luck and have yourselves a great day.